Good afternoon, and thank you all for making time today to attend to this panel. My name is Patricia Rodríguez Blanco, and I am a journalist for the Spanish newspaper El País. I work in a desk called Planeta Futuro, that means future planet, and we cover topics related to development, sustainability, human rights, gender, childhood, just to name a few. That's why I'm very excited to have the opportunity to moderate this panel, which will explore how future generations, those have not yet been born, can participate in decision-making processes and can face the many challenges in the world, like climate change, conflicts, the external debt that hinders development, maybe pandemics. Multilateralism is struggling to rise to this challenge, and the recent 2024 Summit of the Future, or the Declaration of Future Generation, are proof of that. Our panelists today will discuss how to address the interests and needs of future generations, and I encourage you to think any question that comes to mind, as we'll have some time for questions at the end on the panel. And I would like to introduce our panelists. We have an splendid lineup of speakers. First of all, we have Mr. Guy Ryder, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Policy. He played a key role in preparing the 2024 Summit of the Future, the Declaration of Future Generation, and the Pact of the Future. Then our next panelist will be Jutta Urpilainen, the European Commissioner for International Partnerships, who promotes emphasis on intergenerational justice and amplifying the voices of both young and old. Please. And here we have Nudhara Yusuf, whose voice will bring up the perspective of civil society, as he's a prominent advocate for global governance. He was the co-chair of the United Nations 2024 Civil Society Conference in Nairobi, and he was the youngest person to hold this role in 68 years. And finally, we have Sarah Ryglewski, Minister of State of Germany. She oversees the implementation of the Sustainability Development Goals in Germany, with a strong commitment to a just transition towards a sustainable economy. But before our panelists begin, I would like... Before our panelists begin, I would like to introduce Professor Thomas Hell. He's our challenger, and he is going to explain this challenge about future generation. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the sun for joining us on this lovely panel at the end of a fantastic day of sessions here. I would like to start with a question and a challenge to the panel, if I may. And the question is, did the world change on September 22nd, 2024, a few weeks ago? And on that day, 193 member states of the United Nations adopted a pact for the future, including, as part of it, a declaration on future generations, in which they pledge and commit to safeguard the needs and the interests of future generations, defined as those people who will inherit the earth, the people who come after us. And we know that to deliver on that challenge, that commitment, is a huge, huge challenge. Because if you look at the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the crisis in our oceans, all of the important topics we've been speaking about here in Hamburg today, we know that if we do not take urgent action to address them and find ways to do better than we're doing now, we will leave to future generations a world with more deprivation, with more poverty, with more risk, with more disease, with more war, than we have today, and so we will fail to deliver on this commitment that countries have made just a few weeks ago. Now, the answer that many of you are thinking about to my question, did the world change, is probably no. Because you've heard lofty words from international conferences many times in the past 2 decades. You've heard these kinds of pledges and promises. So what's different? What's changed now? To my mind, the potential here is a recognition for the first time that it's actually our systems of governance that are the things that we need to change if we're going to deliver on the sustainability challenge. And the idea that representing future generations, people who will come after us, into our decisions in the present is a way to unlock progress on the sustainability challenges that we face. And so it's a recognition that in a world of long problems and short-term decision-making, we have to change how we make decisions, include people who aren't even here yet into our thinking in a radical way. And that might seem like an empty promise if it weren't for the fact that there's dozens and dozens of innovations all around the world that are doing exactly that are including future generations into decision-making in the present and delivering some pretty transformational results. Last month, the Korean Constitutional Court ordered the government to set a stronger climate target in order to protect future generations. Also recently, the European Commission has appointed a commissioner with intergenerational fairness in their portfolio for the first time. We've also seen different countries around the world as diverse as Finland and Kenya appointing parliamentary committees for the future. We've seen climate assemblies setting long-term targets for local communities and nations. We've seen a lot of governance innovation. And so the challenge for the panel today is how do we take this transformation, the radical potential that this declaration embodies, and make it work, to expand it, to take this groundswell of activity and to spread it all around the world. So I'm hoping we'll hear some solutions on that from the panel today. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Professor Hale. Mr. Ryder, what are the key principles behind the Declaration on Future Generations and how the United Nations envision embedding the perspective of future generations into its policy-making processes?
Well, thanks, Patricia, and thanks to Professor Hales. I'm going to try and answer his challenge, and then I'll answer your question as well. Did the world change that day? Well, no, self-evidently it did not. That does not mean that something important did not happen. Something very important happened with the adoption of the Pact for the Future. The first thing, given the state of our multilateral space at the moment, the fact that 193 countries could come together and agree on a very important document, not an empty procedural document, but a set of really substantive commitments, has an importance in itself. That applies across the Pact for the Future. But if I go to the Declaration on Future Generations, we have given ourselves an opportunity to take decisions in a fundamentally different way. It's a question of method here. It so happens, and it's sometimes ignored, more than 50 of our member states and other organizations such as the EU, we already have mechanisms, sometimes legislation, officials in place, so that policy making does indeed take into account the needs of the unborn. By the way, let's make a distinction. In the Pact for the Future, there is sometimes a mix-up between youth and future generations. The needs of youth is one thing, the needs of future generations is a separate and distinct item. There are links, but they're different.
Yeah.
Now, we have this declaration. In UN terms, it does two things which are very important. It offers the Secretary General the opportunity to appoint a special envoy on future generations. It's a bit like a ping-pong match. The Secretary General proposed it, and the Summit for the Future said, well, you do it if you want to. And the news is he will do it. He's told me that he will be appointing in the coming weeks a special envoy. That might just sound rather formalistic. It actually anchors our work on future generations in a very particular and important way. And to make sure that we are honest about our work, there will be a follow-up. This is provided for in the Declaration on Future Generations, a follow-up high-level meeting of the General Assembly a few years down the road, 83rd session of the General Assembly. So take it from those decisions, not from me. The United Nations is serious about this, to taking to the global stage important things which are already happening at the national level. And I think here is not to ask ourselves the question, why are we trying to take into account future generations? You'd have to be extraordinarily egotistical as a generation to say we should not take into account future generations. The question is not why, it is how we are going to do it. This is a matter of method. Obviously, those future generations are not here to speak for themselves. So we have to put in place mechanisms and also use techniques which we now have at our disposal, not as a purely speculative imagination of what future generations might need, but through strategic foresight, through predictive analytics, use these well-developed techniques to say, well, in this scenario, these are the problems we're going to get, and this is what we need to do about them now to make sure that we do hand down a world fit for future generations. Two more points, and I'm running out of time. One, and it happened already with Professor Hale, when we talk about needs of future generations, it almost automatically becomes a conversation about climate change and the environment. Obviously fundamentally important for future generations. But it's also true of peace and security. It's also true of inequalities. It's also true, as was said, of pandemics. This is not a one-issue story. And the last point I want to make is why now? Why has the moment of looking to the needs of future generations suddenly come onto the table? I've got my own thought about that. My parents' generation grew up at a time when it was a natural expectation that the next generation would live better than the current one. The next generation would live better than the current one. In shorthand, it's the American dream. Each generation would do a bit better. Just carry on doing things as we are doing them, and the next generation will have a better deal. That assumption, call it the death of the American dream, which is not made in America, requires us to look into these new, innovative, I think quite radical, but necessary ways of doing policy making.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder. Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen, how can the European Union guarantee that the concerns of future generations are systematically considered within EU policies?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel discussion, and thank you for the question, Honorable Professor. I have to say that I fully agree with my friend Guy that indeed the world did not change in September, but something important took place in New York. That the world was able to show that multilateralism delivers, that we are still able to agree on something. And I think it's important at the moment where conflicts are taking place in different parts of the world, where most of the discussion at the political level is military and defense, that despite these facts, we are able to agree on something which is more positive. It's about future, and I think it's very valuable. When it comes to European Union, for us it was very important to influence and make sure that the path towards the summit of the future is inclusive. And that's why we were happy to finance, but also facilitate, for instance, the civil society conference or the summit, which took place in Nairobi, which was, well, I would say, one important occasion to prepare also the summit of the future. We were also able to finance CITES conference, which took place in Antigua and Barbuda, so enable different voices to be heard on our way to the summit. And this is very important, I would say, method in general for the European Union. The European Union is a community of values, but it's also a community of different member states, different citizens and stakeholders. So that from that perspective, it is important for us that also young generations, hopefully the future generations, their voice is heard. I give you a couple of examples what we have done. In the content-wise, when it comes to policies and substance, I think we set a very ambitious target to become first climate neutral continent by 2050. We really want to be champion in the climate policy. When it comes to structures, I, as a Commissioner for International Partnerships, I created a global youth sounding board, a structure through which I'm able to hear the voices of young people, but also their guidance and insights. So 25 young people across the world have been advising me as a commissioner. Together with those young people, we actually prepared the first ever youth action plan for the EU's external relations. And there are 3 components in that action plan: empower youth, engage with youth, and connect youth, so young people. And now over 40 delegations across the world, so in 40 countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, we have national youth sounding boards where young people, from different backgrounds, from different minority groups, are giving their guidance and insights to our delegation in terms of different policy substance. And I think if we really want to make an impact for the future generations, we also need to create structures, how the young people can be involved and how their voice is heard. And for us, this has been an excellent tool really to engage with young people at the headquarters level, but also at the national level. I think in addition to that, of course, the main question, and I was asking Guy actually before this panel started, that what's the next step? Because now we have an excellent pact, and Guy, I want to congratulate you, but also the Secretary General, the United Nations as a family, as well as Germany as a facilitator. But the main question is that how are we going to implement that pact? And there we come to the political decision makers in Germany, in each and every of EU member states, and all across the world. How we political leaders make sure that that pact, really will be a reality in our policy making, as well as young people will be included to political decision making. And if I look at the members of the parliament in Africa, in Asia, but also in Europe, unfortunately, there are very few young MPs or even young ministers in the government. So for me, as a politician, I think that there are 2 dimensions: the substance, how we can ensure that there is life also for the future generations. But the second element is really to create platforms and structures through which young people can make their voice heard and influence, and through that also ensure that future generations will be represented.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen. Well, we've got here some young voices. One of them is Nudhara Yusuf. Do you think the challenges of tomorrow will disproportionately affect young people in the global south? And what is the role of civil society in this Declaration of Future Generations?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you so much to the organizers for pulling this panel together. Let me address this question of young people, because I think both of our previous speakers have made really important points. Young people are powerful agents of change, and so need to be involved in decision-making and part of the processes. But equally, as USG Ryder mentioned, we have to be careful to not conflate youth with future generations. There's a reason for that. Young people's future generations is not a young people problem, right? So we all collectively share the burden of not discriminating between when people are born. And every generation is a future generation. The current middle generations are future older generations, will face the problems that older generations of the future face. Current young generations are future middle-aged generations, and so will face those issues. And so I think, while youth play a transitive role, every generation is young before they are older. If we set up young people for success, we're setting up consequent generations for success. But equally, I think being very careful about, as our previous speaker said, not transferring the burden onto young generations to represent future generations, because we all collectively share that responsibility. But going on to both your question, Patricia, and our challenger's question, on sort of unpacking this a little bit, especially in the context of the Global South. Look, we're here in Hamburg, so let me ground the conversation a little bit in sustainability. Sometimes, the Declaration on Future Generations seems so far removed from everything. It's a foresight and futures and imagination. Here's something very concrete. What we know is that the current development model is unsustainable. The way that Western economies developed is unsustainable. So the Declaration on Future Generations is also a thought process of how all the small and middle income countries of today are going to do development. It's grounded in the very real reality that what we currently do in our past history is not necessarily the most sustainable way to move forward. And so we're imagining, thinking about, and projecting a version of development in this context that could be impactful and helpful. So there's very real consequences to the peace and security discussion, to the development discussion. It's not sort of something that we remove and have separately from the rest of the dialogue. So really, we're kind of, saying, thinking of economies, middle-income countries as potential markets is intrinsically extractive. So being quite kind of inclusive is part of the model of the Declaration on Future Generations. So then getting on to your question, Patricia, of the role of civil society. As Professor Hell, you mentioned, there is this sort of declaration. 193 countries have agreed to it, but what does it mean for anyone? And here is where I think civil society plays a very important role. What we've got is essentially a bunch of hooks on the wall, and we need to start hanging coats on them, and that requires concrete action and thought. So allow me to present very quickly about 5 key ways that I think civil society can be contributing to unpacking what on earth the Declaration on Future Generation means to everyone. Firstly, there's a lot of mandates in there, in that Declaration on Future Generation, lots of commitments, lots of ideas. So mapping the mandates, who is responsible for which part of the Declaration on Future Generations, which ministry needs to care about which part of it, and where does it sit in the budget line of a government, right? Secondly, practically, for a day-to-day practitioner, what does thinking about future generations mean? Pick a couple profiles. What does this look like for someone who is an expert in peace and security? What does this look like for someone who is an expert in inclusive societies or civil society participation? So that's the third thing. The second thing. The third thing is, what does this mean for non-CSO stakeholders as well? So take the McKinseys, the Microsofts, the Bains, the EYs of the world. Why should they care about what was in the Declaration on Future Generations? How does it support or go against some of their bottom lines? These are helpful analytical exercises that civil society can be putting forward. Because, for example, I think paragraph 29 and 28 say holistic approaches to futures and foresight. What does that mean, right? And that unpacking needs to happen to implement it carefully. The fourth is to map this onto other multilateral agenda. So what does the Declaration on Future Generations mean for the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, for the AI Summit, for the next Hamburg Sustainability Conference, right? What does this mean moving forward? And then the final thing is then a timeline. What is the administrative sequence that we need to start seeing? So when an envoy gets appointed, what support is required there? What do we need to be doing before said appointment, after said appointment? And how can we kind of push the needle forward so that we're not just renegotiating and reiterating point A again and again, but actually moving from point A to point B. So here, civil society can bring inclusive voices to the table, can bring different perspectives to the table. Global South, youth, other stakeholders, indigenous communities have been thinking about future generations for years and years and years. Where are their voices at the table? And if we're talking about tracking and monitoring and evaluation, who sets the standard for progress? Is that an inclusive standard? Are we benchmarking against inclusive ideas, about ideas that are not necessarily just constructed by a small number of people? So maybe I'll leave it there, but just to say I think we've started a process that now really needs to be unpacked.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Minister Ryglewski, I would like you to explain what kind of states can do. Can you highlight what state members aim to achieve with the future generations?
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say thanks to all my fellow panelists for their really interesting and very fruitful contributions. In Germany, in the Basic Law, in Article 20a, we have the responsibility for decision makers now for future generations. But the sentence is very simple. I will read it to you. Mindful also of its responsibility towards future generations, the state shall protect the natural foundations of life and animals by legislation. Yeah, that sounds so simple, but the question is, what does it mean? Because that's too easy. And I think we are now still not able to understand how massive the change for decision and policy making will be if we take the declaration really if we have to put it in real, because there are some aspects. When we discuss about the sustainability strategy in Germany, we are discussing a lot about spillover effects. Yeah? But we are looking on spillover effects for the people who are living now. But we have to make that phrase a little bit wider. We have to make, we shall look on the spillover effect for future generation. And that means, first of all, we must not make decisions future generations can't revolve. Yeah? And that's really, really massive, because everything we do as politicians is we want to create impact. And now we have to think we must not make decisions with an impact that is not resolvable. So our task is to preserve the possibility for future generations to make their own decisions. But that is not only a passive action. It's not about not doing things, not only about not doing things, but it's also about enabling. That's what you said. It's about create the chance of development for every country in the world. Leave no one behind means we should not leave future generations behind. That's the active part, and that's something we have to work very hard for. But on the other hand, if we talk about transformation, which is a really big issue in Germany, we must not create new path dependencies in technology and in other parts of our policies. So that's something we are now having a big debate in Germany, because we are currently updating our national sustainability strategy. We have a sustainability strategy since 2002. I think that's a long period for a country like Germany, and now we are updating, and that are issues we are heavily debating in the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your insights. Now we have time for questions, so feel free to raise your hands if you would like to ask a question, please.
We were just so clear on the panel that there's no...
No,
That's all.
Yeah.
please, I don't know if we've got a microphone. Well,
Yeah.
Here comes a mic.
There's a micro coming.
Habe ich gesagt? 1919?
Genau, aber wir wollen ja bis 45. Ja, weil Question and Answer ist ein anderes.
Oh.
Ja.
Wusste ich ja nicht. Das ist überhaupt
Mehr Handsender? Hören wir den?
There we go.
it doesn't. Okay.
All right, yeah. Shouting would not have been a sustainable solution.
Kriegen wir den irgendwie?
My name is Ryder. I'm the co-founder of an organization called Impacting Youth. So we work specifically with youth, but also with this question of future generations. And my main question here is, you obviously represent different stakeholder groupings, multilateral organizations, governments, and so on. And the question was raised, how do we get multi-stakeholder buy-in? You mentioned, for example, private sector, your KPMGs, your different stakeholders, but even at a government level. The government representation here is very European, which obviously we're in Hamburg, so that's understandable. But what about other governments around the world? They think differently about future generations. They think differently about youth. How do we ensure we have global multi-stakeholder buy-in into this process?
Okay, thank you. Once,
There was
There was a question. Yeah.
That's gone.
maybe it's better if we ask first this question. Maybe Mr.
Yeah, I can. Well, can I just make a reflection? I think that inclusiveness in all these processes is extraordinarily important. And just looking back at the summit and the pact, they were the product of truly inclusive processes. Now, when it comes to the United Nations, you automatically have 193 member states from the whole world at the table, and that gives you some guarantees. But I want to repeat something that Nudhara said and thank her for the way that she helped us do this. We had a major civil society conference in Kenya in May, for which the European Union provided some of the financing. Thank you. And I think 70% of that conference were African participants, 40% were young people. We've made a real effort at inclusiveness, but it's not always that easy, is it? I think inclusiveness has to be a constant sort of thing in your head. You've got to think, are we including everybody? Are we excluding unwittingly people? And work at it, and work at it, and work at it. You can never do too much.
Well, I have to say that I believe in examples and good practices. And this is what I try to do as a commissioner. Whenever I travel, I don't only meet ministers and political decision makers, the presidents. I always try to also meet civil society representatives, business representatives, as well as young people and youth. And through my meetings, I also want to show an example our partners in the Global South, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, in Latin America, but also in our member states, that, this is how we should work, that we should really give a platform for the different stakeholders and create this kind of a dialogue. So I think this is what we can do in our own position and capacity, but of course, through these different actions taken by taking at the national level, then we can, make an impact to the global level as well. So this is my personal conviction and commitment.
Very quick add-on there, and I thank you both for not only the support of the conference, but also the PR you're doing for the conference afterwards. I appreciate it. The question of what does the UN bring to the table is the table, right? That 193 member states have to sit on, which is a helpful tool to have when we're having discussions about the what next of the world. on the Nairobi conference, in addition to 40% young people, 70% from the African region, we also had 58% women at the conference, so had that representation as well. But it's about more than the representation, it's about what came out of it. So we created some 23 multi-stakeholder impact coalitions that are about the implementation, the follow-through, and the what comes next of the Summit of the Future. The information is on the website, but equally, one of the difficulties of some of these UN processes is the complexity, the jargon, and the UN-based language that makes it difficult for other stakeholders to get involved. Here, I think civil society, especially young people, are very good at that translation and can think about ways to headline information in ways that are effective to other stakeholder groups. So I think a real translation exercise needs to take place to get people to buy into what's just happened in New York.
Mm-hmm. I was one of the people who were once young before she grew older, and when I was young, for me it was important to tackle every political issue. I was interested in a wide range of political topics. And the other thing, what I think is really important for young people is that we create space for them to interact with each other from different countries all over the world. I was socialized in the JUSOs, that's the youth organization of the Social Democrats in Germany, and we have a big global alliance, the Union of Socialist Youth, and for me that were the most fruitful and most memorable moments in my political career, because I got the perspective of other young people from all over the world. And what we need is that they have the chance to talk to each other, to see what is different, but what are the similarities, because they are the next generation, not the future generation, but the next generation of decision makers and policy makers, and they need to have a better spirit for their common generation than we had once before.
Thank you very much. Well, we have time for one more question, please.
Still doesn't work. Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
I'm not a genius with technology, sorry. Okay, thanks a lot for the panel. I loved it. And my question would be, since we talked a lot about coming generations facing multi-crisis, like emerging modern wars or the climate change and various others, how can we prioritize, or how can we avoid this need to prioritize between the different needs of future generations to reach a sustainable solution, including everyone? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So maybe...
Yeah, it's a really good question, because at the moment in the German parliament there's a big debate about whether we should prioritize the SDGs in our strategy. And I have not decided yet if I think it's a good concept, because there are so many interdependencies between the SDGs that I think you can't do one without the other. You have to look what resources do you have, but the decision the concept of our new strategy is that we will strengthen the social aspects of the SDGs, because we believe that if you enable more people, they will do better decisions. If you have more people who are able to articulate their interests, who can make their own decisions, you will get better decisions. So, yeah, I don't have one answer, because it's really complex, but I think the solution is to strengthen the people, because then you will get better decisions and you don't need to prioritize.
Agree. Very, very difficult question. 3 very quick additional thoughts. Firstly, global governance is an ecosystem. If we each play our niche role well, we don't have to trade off as much as we think. Secondly, accelerators. So across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there are some common things that you can do that will accelerate multiple goals in one go, and there needs to be proper diagnostics into what those accelerators are and investment in them. And third and finally, if it looks like you have to trade off today to get tomorrow, you'll always pick today over tomorrow, which is a harmful narrative to have in budgets, in our planning, in our strategies. So how do we think about tomorrow in the context of what we do today is an important kind of idea to put out there.
Thank you very much. Well, very briefly,
it's a question about political will. Is there enough political will? And of course, then it's also about political narrative. How are we able to communicate that narrative to our voters who are thinking of themselves? And I think it's something what Guy, you said in the beginning, that I want to leave this world in a better shape to my kids and their children as I receive this world. There is a very famous Finnish songwriter who has written a song about tourism, that actually each and every human being is a kind of tourist in his or her life. So we live here a certain time of the period, and then there are next tourists waiting for their turn. And I think this is a kind of philosophy that, okay, it's now our moment, but then we have to take care that those who are waiting for their turn, they also have, place here. And I think this is something we need to be able to communicate to the voters in order to create this kind of political will.
I'm sorry because we don't have more time for more questions, but before we conclude, I give the floor again to Professor Thomas Hell, please.
Thank you, Patricia. So the question we started with was, did the world change on September 22nd? And the challenge of the panel was, how do we realize the potential of this new document that we have, this new commitment to deliver some of that change? I think we heard three answers. We heard that multilateralism can work, and that actually the ability of the world to come together, to think about how, and all the challenges that we have, to the question here, all the crises that we face, to understand that those crises are fundamentally connected to longer-term challenges and drivers as well. So we have to address the urgent, even as we build resilience for the deep solutions that can come through a long-term approach. Two, we heard some conceptual breakthroughs, for example, the distinguishing between future generations, people yet to come, and youth today, both critical stakeholders to involve in our decision-making to improve them and make them more sustainable. And third, and probably most importantly, we heard so clearly about the need to have the method, to change the structure, to get governments, but also business and civil society and others to change the way we do things, to realize this single sentence that the minister gave us, and to weave that through budgeting and decision-making at all levels of government. That's the challenge we have before us now. So the final challenge to leave us with is, how do we take it forward from here? And it's wonderful to hear that the Secretary General will follow through on this envoy. That's an exciting development at the multilateral level. But I think it's also a challenge for all of us in this room. How can forums like this, the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, take forward this conversation on future generations? Can it be a home for us to come back and discuss some of these issues again going forward? So that's not just a challenge for those on the panel, but for the challenge for all of us here to take into this beautiful sunny afternoon. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry because we have to finish the debate. Thank you all the speakers because your insightful contributions. Thank you the audience. I'm looking forward to continue to debate this debate in the future. Thank you very much. Have a very nice conference.
I think we'll take a